All right, diving right in, folks. We're all about upping your English game today. Specifically, we're tackling casual conversations. You know, the kind that make you sound like you've been hanging out with native speakers your whole life.
Exactly right. And to get there, we're taking a deep dive into mastering daily conversations. Speak like a native.
This guide really stresses something I think we can all relate to.
Yeah, it's one thing to learn all the grammar rules and memorize vocabulary lists.
Which is important. Don't get me wrong. You need that foundation.
Absolutely, foundational stuff for sure. But the guide's point is that it's not enough to just know the technical side of English.
You got to sound natural, right? Like you're not even thinking about the rules. You're just talking.
Exactly. It's about mastering those subtle cues and expressions that native speakers use without even thinking about it. That's what makes you truly blend in.
So where do we even begin? What does the guide suggest? Let's break it down.
Well, one of the first things they highlight is the power of idioms, slang, and phrasal verbs.
Oh.
Yeah, these are the things that add that extra flavor to your conversations.
It's like instead of saying I'm happy, you could say I'm over the moon.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And suddenly your English sounds more colorful, more expressive.
And slang, man, that can be a minefield sometimes.
It can, but it's also so essential for sounding natural.
The guide has some good tips on how to navigate that, right?
They do. They suggest starting small. Maybe pick one new slang word or idiom each day and try to use it in a natural context. Don't just memorize a whole dictionary of slang, you know?
It's about integrating those expressions into your everyday speech, making them your own.
Exactly. Like instead of saying, I'm going to the store, you could say, I'm going to hit up the shop.
Now you're talking.
Right. It instantly makes you sound more like a native speaker.
And it can be a lot of fun, too, experimenting with those different expressions.
Definitely. Now, while we're on the topic of sounding natural, let's shift gears a bit and talk about pronunciation and intonation.
Oh, yeah. These are biggies. The guide really stresses the importance of those, doesn't it?
They do. And for good reason. It's not enough to just know how to pronounce individual words correctly.
It's about linking them together smoothly, right? Creating that natural flow.
Exactly. Think about how native speakers talk. They often blend words together, especially in casual settings.
Like say, what day you mean, instead of what do you mean?
Perfect example. And intonation. That's all about the music of your voice, the rise and fall that adds emotion and nuance to your speech.
Oh, I see. So like a simple hello can sound completely different depending on your intonation.
Exactly. You can say hello with excitement, with surprise, with boredom, even with sarcasm.
It's like giving your words an extra layer of meaning. Now, how do we master that? It sounds kind of tricky.
It takes practice, for sure. But the guide suggests a technique called shadowing, which can be really effective.
Shadowing? What's that?
It's basically listening to a native speaker and trying to imitate their pronunciation, intonation, and even their rhythm.
Like I could just pick my favorite English-speaking YouTuber and try to copy how they speak.
Exactly. You're basically shadowing their speech patterns. And there are some great apps out there like EALA that can help you with this too.
So it's like having a personal pronunciation coach in your pocket.
Precisely.
Now, all of this sounds great, but let's be real for a second. A lot of us struggle with simply remembering all the new words we need to learn.
Oh, for sure. Vocabulary can be a challenge.
I've tried those flashcards, those lists, all that stuff. It's tough.
I hear you. Memorizing endless lists of words can feel super overwhelming.
The guide offers some different approaches, right? Something a little less daunting.
Yes, it encourages us to think differently about vocabulary learning. Instead of just memorizing isolated words, it suggests learning new words in context.
So like instead of just memorize the word schedule, I would learn it in a phrase like, what's your schedule today?
Exactly. You're seeing the word in action, understanding how it's used naturally in a sentence.
And that makes it stick better, right? Because you're actually using it, not just memorizing it.
Exactly. It becomes a part of your active vocabulary, not just a passive one.
Love it. And the guide also has this other really cool idea. It's about keeping what they call a conversation journal.
Ah, yes, the conversation journal.
So what is this magical journal all about?
It's not magical per se, but it is super useful. It's basically a notebook where you jot down any interesting words or phrases you come across in your daily life.
So if I hear a new slang term on a podcast, I'd write it down.
Exactly. Or if you see a cool idiom in a movie or hear a phrasal verb that you've never heard before, just write it down in your journal.
So it's like creating my own personal dictionary of cool English expressions.
Precisely. And then you can go back and review those words and phrases, practice using them in your own conversations.
It's about making them a part of your everyday language.
Exactly. And speaking of everyday language, let's talk about real-life conversations.
All right, the real deal.
Yeah, the heart of the matter. Because let's be honest, a lot of language learners, myself included at one point, can find real-life conversations really intimidating.
Especially in English, right? It can feel like you're constantly on edge, worried about making mistakes, not understanding everything.
Oh, absolutely. The pressure is real. And the guide addresses this head-on. They really emphasize that there is absolutely no substitute for real-life practice when it comes to mastering conversational fluency.
So it's about getting out there and actually talking to people, even if it feels scary at first.
Exactly. And the guide offers some great tips on how to find those opportunities for real-life practice. Like, you could try language exchange apps.
Oh, like HelloTalk or Tandem, where you connect with native speakers who are learning your language, right?
Exactly. And you can help each other practice. It's a win-win situation. Or look for discussion groups in your local area or online that focus on topics that interest you.
That way, you're not just practicing your English, you're also engaging in conversations that you actually care about.
Absolutely. And another thing the guide recommends is role-playing.
Role-playing. You mean like pretending we're ordering food at a restaurant or something?
Exactly. It might seem a little silly, but it's actually a super effective way to practice those everyday conversations in a safe and controlled environment.
It's like a dress rehearsal for the real thing.
Exactly. You can work out any kinks, practice different responses, and build up your confidence before you're actually in that situation.
I love that. And speaking of confidence, there's one more element that the guide emphasizes as being crucial for mastering casual conversations in English. And that is the art of small talk.
Small talk.
The bane of many a language learner's existence. It's like you can conjugate verbs and write essays, but then you get stuck talking about the weather.
Right. It can feel so superficial, so pointless.
The guide has some interesting insights on this, right? It kind of reframe how we think about small talk.
They do. They explain that small talk is essentially a social ritual in English-speaking cultures. It's not about exchanging profound information. It's more about being polite, showing interest, and establishing a connection, however brief it may be.
It's like the verbal equivalent of a handshake.
Exactly. And there are certain phrases and responses that are almost like a script. For instance, when someone says, "How are you?" the expected response is usually something like, "I'm good, thanks. How are you?"
It's not an invitation to launch into a detailed account of your day, right?
Exactly. It's more of a social pleasantry. So the guide's advice is to focus on mastering those basic scripts and then gradually expanding your repertoire as you become more comfortable.
So it's about understanding the rules of the game before you start playing, so to speak. And they recommend some good conversation starters, right? Safe topics that are generally good for small talk.
They do. Things like the weather, sports, current events, those neutral topics that are easy to talk about without getting too deep.
It's about finding those easy entry points into a conversation.
Precisely. And, once you've mastered the art of initiating a conversation, the next challenge is keeping it going.
And that's where active listening comes in, right? Something else the guide really emphasizes.
Yes. Active listening is essential for having meaningful conversations, whether they're casual or more formal.
It's about more than just hearing the words, isn't it? It's about actually engaging with what the other person is saying.
Exactly. Active listening involves paying attention to the speaker's tone of voice, their facial expressions, their body language. You're gathering clues to decipher the full message.
It's almost like being a detective. You're looking for those subtle cues that reveal what the speaker is really feeling or thinking.
Precisely. And the guide suggests a great exercise for practicing active listening. Try to summarize a podcast or a conversation you've just listened to.
That's a good one. It forces you to really pay attention and make sure you've captured the main points. Now, speaking of capturing the essence of English, one of the most interesting concepts the guide explores is this idea of immersion. What's their take on that?
They really emphasize the importance of making English a part of your daily life, even outside of structured study.
It's about surrounding yourself with the language as much as possible. But how do you do that, especially if you don't live in an English-speaking country?
Well, the guide is full of creative ideas. They suggest things like changing your phone settings to English, following English-speaking social media accounts, listening to English music or podcasts. Even if you don't understand everything at first, you're still absorbing the sounds and rhythms of the language.
It's about creating that English-speaking environment for yourself, right? Even if it's just in your own little world.
Exactly. And they also talk about narrating your daily tasks in English. It might feel a little silly at first, but it's a great way to get yourself thinking in English, like I'm pouring myself a cup of coffee, now I'm gonna make breakfast. Simple things like that.
It's about finding those small, consistent ways to integrate English into your daily routine.
Precisely. And that brings us back to something we talked about earlier, role-playing.
Ah, yes. Pretending we're in all sorts of different situations, practicing those everyday conversations.
Exactly. And the guide actually gives a specific example of a role-playing scenario. They say, imagine you're at a cafe and you want to order a latte.
Okay, I'm imagining it. I'm at the counter. The barista's smiling at me. What do I say?
You could say, can I get a latte, please?
Can I get a latte, please? All right, I'm feeling confident already.
And then the barista might say, sure, what size would you like? Small, medium, or large?
Medium, please. Boom. I got this.
There you go. See, it's all about breaking down those everyday interactions into manageable chunks.
And practicing them until they feel natural.
Exactly. And the guide has another really cool suggestion for taking your role-playing to the next level. They recommend recording yourself while you're doing it.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, sure.
Then you can listen back and analyze your performance.
Exactly. You can check your pronunciation, your intonation, the overall flow of your speech. It's like having a personal speech coach in your pocket.
Love it. Now let's talk about something that every language learner dreads. Making mistakes.
Ah, yes, the dreaded mistakes.
The guide actually has a pretty interesting take on this, right?
They do. They encourage us to reframe how we think about mistakes. They remind us that making mistakes is an inevitable part of the learning process. In fact, it's how we learn and grow.
So instead of seeing mistakes as failures, we should see them as feedback.
Exactly. They're opportunities to learn and improve.
They even have this great tip for turning those mistakes into learning experiences. They call it keeping a mistake diary.
The mistake diary, yes, it's a brilliant idea.
So what is this magical mistake diary all about?
Well, it's basically just a notebook where you jot down any errors you make, along with the correct way to say or write something. It's about turning those mistakes into personalized learning material.
I love that. It's like taking ownership of your mistakes and using them to your advantage.
Exactly. And speaking of learning from our mistakes, another great resource the guide highlights is learning from native content.
Oh yeah, this is the fun part. We get to watch movies, TV shows, listen to music, read books.
Exactly. It's about immersing yourself in the language and picking up on those natural rhythms, those subtle expressions, those cultural nuances that you just don't get from textbooks.
So it's about going beyond just understanding the words on the page or the screen and actually absorbing the art of communication.
Precisely. And the guide suggests a great way to make the most of this native content. They recommend watching with and without subtitles.
Oh, that's smart. So you can start with subtitles to get the gist of what's being said and then gradually wean yourself off them as your listening comprehension improves.
Exactly. It's about challenging yourself, but also finding that sweet spot where you're still enjoying the content.
Now, before we wrap things up, there's one more nugget of wisdom from the guide that I just have to mention. And it's about those little words and sounds that we often try to avoid. Those likes, all those fillers.
Ah, the fillers. I used to think those were the enemy. Like they made you sound unprofessional, unprepared.
Me too. But the guide actually has a totally different perspective on this, right?
They do. They explain that fillers are incredibly common in natural spoken English and that they actually serve a purpose.
Wait, really? I always thought they were just bad habits.
Well, if they're overused, they can be distracting. But in moderation, fillers actually help your speech sound more natural, more authentic. They give you time to think and can also soften the tone of your speech. Think about it. Native speakers use fillers all the time without even realizing it.
It's true. I never really thought about it that way. So what's the takeaway here? Should we be intentionally inserting ums and nos into our conversations?
Not necessarily. It's not about forcing it. It's more about recognizing that fillers are a natural part of spoken English and not being afraid to use them when they feel appropriate.
It's about embracing those imperfections of language and sounding more like a real person, not a robot.
Exactly. And that, my friend, is the beauty of language. It's about connection, expression, and embracing those imperfections that make us uniquely human.
Beautifully said. This guide is full of such great insights. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. But for now, let's take a pause and come back to continue our deep dive into mastering daily conversations. Speak like a native.
So before the break, we were digging into this whole idea of making English a part of your life beyond just, studying grammar and memorizing words.
Right, like really living and breathing English as much as possible.
Exactly. It's about finding those little ways to weave English into your everyday routine. Like changing your phone settings to English.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I've done that before. It's kind of fun to see all the apps and menus in a different language.
It is. It's a subtle shift, but it can make a big difference in terms of just getting used to seeing English all around you.
And it's not just about our phones, right? What about social media?
Social media is a gold mine for English immersion. You can follow interesting accounts, read articles, watch videos, all in English.
It's like a constant stream of authentic language right at your fingertips.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the power of entertainment. Movies, TV shows, music podcasts.
Okay, now you're talking my language.
Right.
I love a good Netflix binge session.
Right. And the great thing is you can actually turn that binge watching into a learning experience.
How so?
Well, even if you need subtitles at first, you're still absorbing the language. You're hearing those natural rhythms, those authentic expressions.
And the guides suggest some specific things to pay attention to.
Right. They do. They encourage us to really observe how native speakers express emotions, how they use humor, even how they exchange greetings.
It's like those little cultural cues that you don't always pick up on in a textbook.
Exactly. And they also have this great tip about watching with and without subtitles.
Yeah, that's a good one. Start with subtitles to get the gist of what's being said, and then try watching without them to challenge yourself.
It's a great way to level up your listening comprehension skills. And another fun way to practice is by narrating your daily activities in English.
Narrating my day. So like, I'm brushing my teeth now, I'm getting dressed, I'm making coffee.
Exactly. It might feel a little silly at first, but it gets you in the habit of thinking in English.
It's like creating your own personal English language soundtrack to your life.
I love that analogy. Now, speaking of soundtracks, let's talk about another technique that the guide emphasizes for mastering those casual conversations.
Hit me with it.
Role-playing.
Ah, yes. Pretending we're in all sorts of exciting scenarios. Ordering food at a restaurant, checking into a hotel, asking for directions.
Exactly. It's a fun and effective way to practice those everyday interactions in a safe and controlled environment.
And it can be a real confidence booster too, right?
Absolutely, because you get to practice those conversations ahead of time, so when you're actually in that situation, you're not as nervous.
It's like a dress rehearsal for real life.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And, the guide actually gives a specific example of a role-playing scenario. They say, imagine you're at a cafe and you want to order a latte.
Okay, I'm there, I'm at the counter. What do I say?
You could say something like, can I get a latte, please?
Can I get a latte, please?
All right.
I think I can handle that.
And then the barista might ask, sure, what size would you like? Small, medium, or large?
Easy, medium, please.
Perfect. See, you're a natural.
I'm feeling more confident already.
And the guide even suggests taking your role-playing to the next level by recording yourself.
Recording myself? What for?
So you can listen back and analyze your performance, check your pronunciation, your intonation, the overall flow of your speech.
It's like having your own personal speech coach in your pocket.
Exactly. And speaking of coaching, let's talk about something that often trips up language learners.
You mean making mistakes?
Exactly, those dreaded mistakes. But you know what? The guide actually encourages us to embrace those mistakes.
Embrace them. Really?
Yeah. They remind us that mistakes are a natural part of the learning process. In fact, they're valuable feedback that helps us refine our skills and deepen our understanding.
So instead of seeing mistakes as failures, we should see them as opportunities.
Exactly. They're stepping stones on the path to fluency.
I like that shift in perspective. And the guide actually provides a really practical tip for turning those mistakes into learning experiences. They suggest keeping what they call a mistake diary.
Ah, yes, the mistake diary. It's a brilliant tool.
So what is this magical mistake diary all about?
It's basically just a notebook where you write down any errors you make along with the correct way to say or write something. It's a way to turn those mistakes into personalized learning material.
I love that idea. It's about taking ownership of your mistakes and using them to your advantage. Now, speaking of learning opportunities, let's talk about one of my favorite ways to improve my English: immersing myself in native content.
Yes, movies, TV shows, music, books, all that good stuff.
Exactly. It's like a language playground.
Yeah.
But how do we turn those enjoyable activities into real learning experiences?
Well, the guide encourages us to pay attention to the details. How native speakers express emotions, how they use humor, how they structure their sentences.
It's about going beyond just understanding the words and really absorbing the nuances of the language.
Precisely. And they also recommend a great technique for challenging your listening comprehension, watching with and without subtitles.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. Start with subtitles to get the gist of what's being said, and then try watching without them to see how much you can understand.
It's a great way to train your ear and improve your listening skills. And, another way to immerse yourself is by narrating your daily activities in English.
Oh yeah, we were talking about that earlier. It's a fun little exercise that gets you thinking in English.
Exactly. Now, are you ready for a really controversial topic?
Bring it on.
Let's talk about those little sounds that we often try to avoid. Those, like all those fillers.
Oh man, I used to think those were the enemy. Like if I said, or, in a conversation, it meant I wasn't fluent enough.
I hear you. I used to feel the same way. But you know what? The guide actually has a completely different take on fillers.
Really? Do tell.
They explain that fillers are incredibly common in natural spoken English and that they actually serve a purpose.
Wait a minute. Are you telling me that saying, is actually okay?
In moderation, yes. Of course, if you overuse them, it can become distracting. But using a few fillers here and there can actually help your speech sound more natural, more authentic.
Wow, that's a mind shift. So instead of seeing fillers as bad habits, we should see them as tools that can actually improve our fluency.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between sounding polished and sounding natural.
And I remember the guide even gave an example of how to use fillers effectively.
They did. Imagine someone saying, well, I think we could leave now. Unless you want to stay a bit longer.
I see. The fillers add those little pauses that make the speech sound less abrupt and give the speaker a moment to gather their thoughts.
Exactly. It's about making your speech sound more like how people actually talk, not like a robot.
This is all about embracing those imperfections of language and sounding more human.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point that the guide makes about language learning. It's about being patient with yourself. It's a journey, not a race.
So true. It's easy to get discouraged when you hit those inevitable bumps in the road.
Absolutely. But the guide reminds us that persistence is key. It's about celebrating those small victories along the way and not giving up on yourself.
It's about finding joy in the process and remembering that every little step forward is a win.
Exactly. And with that in mind, let's shift gears and talk about one of the most important aspects of mastering any language: building confidence.
Confidence is key, right? Because if you don't feel confident in your ability to communicate, you're less likely to actually put yourself out there and practice.
Exactly. And you know what? The guide has some brilliant tips for overcoming those confidence hurdles.
Like what? Give me the good stuff.
Well, one of the things they emphasize is the importance of positive self-talk.
So instead of beating myself up for every little mistake I make, I should focus on the progress I'm making.
Exactly. Celebrate those wins no matter how small they may seem. And remember that everyone makes mistakes. It's part of the learning process.
That's such a good reminder. It's easy to get caught up in those negative thoughts, but focusing on the positive can make a world of difference.
Absolutely. And another great way to build confidence is by surrounding yourself with supportive people.
People who encourage you and believe in your ability to learn English.
Exactly. Whether it's a language partner, a tutor, a friend, or a family member, having that support system can make a huge difference.
It's about creating that positive learning environment where you feel comfortable taking risks and making mistakes.
Precisely. Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier: the power of native content.
Oh yeah, movies, TV shows, music, podcasts, all those amazing resources that can help us learn and grow.
Exactly. And you know what? The guide actually suggests some specific things to pay attention to when we're consuming this content.
Like what? Fill me in.
Well, they encourage us to really pay attention to how native speakers use the language, how they express emotions, how they use humor, even how they structure their sentences.
It's about going beyond just understanding the words and really absorbing those subtle nuances of the language.
Precisely. And they also recommend a great technique for challenging your listening comprehension, watching with and without subtitles.
Oh yeah, we talked about that earlier. It's a great way to train your ear and see how much you can understand without relying on those subtitles.
Exactly. And another fun way to immerse yourself is by narrating your daily activities in English.
That's a good one. It's like creating your own personal English language soundtrack to your life.
I love that analogy. Now, before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listener with one final thought from the guide.
All right, I'm all ears.
The guide emphasizes that fluency is not a destination, it's a journey.
So true. It's a journey that's full of twists and turns, ups and downs.
Exactly. And it's a journey that's well worth taking. The ability to connect with others in a meaningful way in English is an incredibly rewarding experience.
I couldn't agree more. And this whole deep dive has really been a journey in itself.
It has. We've explored so many fascinating aspects of conversational English, from the nuances of pronunciation and intonation to the art of small talk and the power of active listening.
I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm excited to put all these tips into practice.
Me too. And I hope our listener is feeling the same way.
Yeah, it's like you said earlier, it's about making English a part of your life, not just a subject you study.
Exactly. It's about finding those little moments throughout the day where you can connect with the language. Maybe listen to an English song while you're making dinner, or watch a 5-minute English language news clip online.
It's those little things that can make a big difference over time.
Absolutely. And the more you immerse yourself in the language, the more natural it will start to feel, and the more fun you'll have with it too.
Speaking of fun, one of the things I really appreciated about this guide is how it encourages us to not take ourselves too seriously, to embrace those little imperfections and just enjoy the process.
Yeah, like giving yourself permission to use those fillers, those ums and you knows. I mean, we all do it.
Exactly. And it's about celebrating those small victories too. Like maybe you finally nailed that tricky pronunciation or had a conversation with a native speaker without feeling completely lost. Those are moments to be proud of.
Definitely. It's about focusing on the progress you're making, not the mistakes you might make along the way.
This deep dive has been such a great reminder of that. We've covered so much ground today, from pronunciation and intonation to slang and idioms to active listening and small talk. And through it all, the message has been clear. If you want to sound more like a native English speaker, you have to get out there and actually use the language. You have to immerse yourself in it, make it a part of your life, and most importantly, have fun with it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Fluency is not a destination, it's a journey. And it's a journey that's full of fascinating discoveries and unexpected delights. So to our listener, we say, keep exploring, keep practicing, keep those conversations flowing, and most importantly, enjoy the ride.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into mastering daily conversations. Speak like a native. Thanks for joining us, and happy chatting.